will fill the room from the front end. So in a sense, those who are at the back, if you could just come closer to us so we can all be a lot more cozier in this really cozy room. Okay. Okay, perfect. So I think that is all right, and that we can all begin. I am seeing a few familiar faces in the room, and I believe that a compliment for the new year is still in order, and especially since that I haven't seen you since last year. And a best wishes, of course, for 2024. And these are faces that we have the pleasure of engaging throughout the year at CNBC Africa through the discourse of business. I'm also seeing a lot of faces I have not yet had the pleasure to meet. And it is a good morning to you also. It is a pleasure to be in your company for the next hour or so as we discuss a topic that we all have vested interest in, of course, a topic that concerns our current, present, and our future, a topic about our home. I'd also like to extend the same warm welcome to those who are joining us virtually. We do hope that you will participate in the event by sending through any questions or comments that you might have to facilitate the discussion and, of course, add to the contribution that is sought here. As you know, we are here to reflect on the state of the African continent right now with the launch of the first of two reports that will be giving us an idea of what the continent looks like right now and also its prospects for the rest of the year and the medium term. It is a guide, as you do know, for a lot of policymakers to choose the appropriate tools, as it were, to see how they can best fix the challenges that their economies are facing, but also how they can sharpen some of the opportunities that are present within their respective territories. It's also a map, I think, for investors to see where their capital can find the most love, and I use the word love just reminiscing on the fact that we are in the month of love right now. But of course, in terms of capital, it's the love that will ultimately increase returns for their investments and their stakeholders. So the agenda for today is a pretty simple one. Many of you will be familiar with the format. We will get a high-level view of the report, its findings, so that we're all on the same page as to its latest contents. We'll engage in a panel discussion with key experts who will also add their insights and their contributions. And what I'm looking forward to also is a contributions from yourselves as audience members. I anticipate that you won't be a passive audience, but rather an active one. I am aware that I'm in the company of very smart minds who I look forward to engaging further through your contributions and comments to what is shared, particularly during the panel discussion. So please do engage. Before we do get the show formally on the road, I would like for us to log in to this video that's about to play, just to formally set the tone and the context for today's proceedings.
Winds of economic change are constantly blowing across Africa. But knowing that these gusts will sway through our economies, we can plan ahead to reap their benefits and mitigate their challenges. This is why in January of 2023, the African Development Bank launched the inaugural Africa's Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report. Now we present the 2024 edition, an assessment of Africa's macroeconomic performance in 2022 and 2023 and its short to medium-term outlook for 2024 and 2025 amid dynamic global economic developments. Africa has recently faced significant headwinds, ranging from the COVID-19 pandemic to global conflicts and regional political instabilities, slowing the continent's growth in tandem with global economic uncertainty. While Africa's average real GDP growth fell to an estimated 3.2% in 2023 from 4.1% in 2022, 15 African countries grew by 5% or more. This reflects the rebound in investment, tourism, mining, and economic diversification. Africa also remains the second fastest growing region after Asia, underpinning the continent's resilience to shocks. The slowdown just in average growth corresponds to the regional variations based on domestic policies in place to cushion the impact of shocks. Economic growth in Central Africa is projected to drop from an estimated 3.8% in 2023 to 3.5% in 2024, then rise to 4.1% in 2025. East Africa is expected to post higher growth of 5.1% in 2024 and 5.7% in 2025, up from an estimated 3.5% in 2023. Real GDP growth in North Africa is projected to remain steady at 3.9% in 2024, then improve slightly to 4.1% in 2025. Southern Africa is projected to experience slight growth from an estimated 1.6% in 2023 to 2.2% in 2024 and 2.6% in 2025. West Africa's GDP growth is projected to rise from an estimated 3.2% in 2023 to 4% in 2024 and continue to 4.4% in 2025. Inflation in Africa has risen since COVID-19, driven by increasing global food and energy prices, domestic fiscal largesse, domestic agricultural supply shocks, and the depreciation of national currencies against the US dollar. At the same time, deficits have improved due to relatively better revenue performance following a slump during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2022. Public debt is declining, but debt vulnerabilities remain elevated. Higher borrowing costs and public debt reflect tightening global financial conditions, which have limited African governments' investments in growth-promoting sectors. Overall, Africa's external position is expected to deteriorate in 2024, driven by declining global commodity prices. Yet, despite the decline in foreign direct investments to Africa, Africa remained attractive, with new projects increasing by 39% to 766, and in 2022, Africa accounted for 40% of mega projects, meaning those worth more than $10 billion each. If well executed and successful, these projects will offer growth, job creation, and technology transfer to the continent. Lifting Africa's growth from the slowdown of 2023 will require a policy mix including adopting policies to tame elevated inflation and creating incentives to stimulate economic growth, accelerating economic diversification, strengthening exports, and fiscal consolidation to increase resilience to shocks. Sustained governance reforms to strengthen debt management capacity, strong fiscal institutions to efficiently mobilize more domestic resources and ensure their prudent use, scaling up government investments in digital infrastructure to curb resource leakages and improve efficiency of service delivery, building a workforce with appropriate skills. Reforms to the global financial aid architecture to mobilize resources at scale that meet Africa's development financing needs. Africa does not have to merely go where its economic winds blow. With this report, we can analyze, plan, and execute policies that propel our economies towards development that makes our nation soar.
Thank you for that video. Quite a lot of production I can see went into it. And I do like the phrase that Africa does not necessarily need to go where its economic winds blow, the challenging winds that is. And of course, it can steer through some of that turbulence and put itself on a more smoother path. But to officially give us the welcome for today, I would like to introduce one of the greatest champions, most passionate champions on the continent that I have met, of course, and not only an advocate, but an implementer of the change that he would like to see, the president of the African Development Bank, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina. So this floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Sorry I have a little bit of cold. It's got nothing to do with the trends that you're seeing. I might have to show a little bit more resilience, I guess, because of that. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Fifi. Peters, thank you for all the great work you do, and all of you at the CNBC Africa, which is Africa's #1 business, economic and financial analysis network. So well done. Please give it up to them. They're doing a great job. My dear brother, Honorable Commissioner Muchanga, it's nice to see you. Honorable ministers that are here, my dear brother, friend, and co-warrior, Jeffrey Sachs, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, thank you very much for being here. And your dear wife, Sonia, thank you very much for being here. Professor Abebe, Shimelis, it's good to see you again. You seem to be much younger than last time I saw you. So maybe when I saw you, I was giving you too much stress, but it's good to see you. You're looking good. Executive Directors of the African Development Bank, honorable ministers that are joining, and those that are joining us also virtually, Vice Presidents of the bank directors that are here. Welcome, everybody, to this event. Welcome to the presentation of the 2024 February edition of Africa's Macroeconomic Policy, Performance and Outlook of the African Development Bank Group. Now, this report is a biannual publication that we release in the first and third quarters of each year. It complements the African Economic Outlook, the African Development Bank's annual flagship publication, which we launch always at our annual meetings in May. And for those of you that need to be at the annual meetings, in fact, I want all of you to be at the annual meetings. It's going to be in Nairobi this year in May. The Macroeconomic Performance Outlook report provides African policymakers, African and global investors, researchers, and other development partners with an up-to-date evidence-based assessment of Africa's recent macroeconomic performance and short to medium outlook and dynamic global economic developments. Today, as we gather here this morning, like other regions in the world, Africa continues to face multiple crises, as you heard in the video, including rising cost of living, weakening of economic growth, a tightening of global financial conditions, shortage of concessional resources, increasing effects of climate change, lingering impacts of the health pandemics that we had, conflicts and geopolitical tensions, both at home and also outside, of course, at the global level. The interaction of these global and regional crises with existing regional structural weaknesses threatens to halt Africa's gradual economic recovery and is hindering socioeconomic developments. The release of Africa's Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook 2024 in this first quarter of this year, therefore, comes at an opportune time as countries need regular diagnostics and targeted policy actions to tackle these multiple crises. As you heard in the video presentation, our estimates reveal that Africa's average real GDP growth declined from 3.2% in 2023, came down to 3.2% in 2023, down from 4.1% in 2020. The momentum of Africa's growth recovery has slowed against a backdrop of all these multiple crises that I have mentioned. But despite these challenging global and regional economic environments, 15 African countries have posted output expansions of more than 5%. The report shows that Africa is projected to remain the fastest growing region in the world after Asia, exceeding the global average of 3% in 2023. It is forecasted that Africa will account for 11 out of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world in 2024. And so we project that growth on the continent will rebound to 3.8% in 2024. And we expect that growth to be relatively broad-based, although domestic supply bottlenecks such as shortfalls in electricity generation are still lingering, especially in Southern Africa, especially South Africa. But let me be clear about one thing. Percentage growth is percentage growth. We don't eat those things, right? The poverty levels on the continent are still very, very high. And so for us to be able to really, what you're talking about is, how are we going to deal with the structural impediments to faster growth of Africa? People talk a lot about the need for Africa to leapfrog. I don't believe there's anything called leapfrog, because a frog can't leap at all. It's just here to there. Africa needs a projectile. It needs to grow consistently, maybe for 10, 15 years, at more than double, about double growth rate, GDP growth rates, to be able to bring down the GDP per capita to a level, and bring it up to a level that actually will allow our people to come out of poverty. So I think we're still dancing a little bit around the edges here. I don't want to over-push the fact that you're going fast, but when you're going fast and other people's economy are huge and yours isn't as huge, it means that you have to grow very, very fast. So for me, I think the structural impediments are big. Infrastructure continues to be big. Climate change continues to be a major challenge for us in many of our economies. And you find a situation in which industrialization is still not going well. So you do have to have those things that restrict export-oriented industrial manufacturing stance of the continent to be able to expand the resources that it's getting. Those are the things that we ought to be worrying about. And in particular, also, we talk about a critical sector, which is agriculture. We all know that. Even with the rising global commodity prices that we have because of climate change, we have to unlock, Jeff and I have been working on this for decades. We have to unlock the potential of the agricultural sector and make sure that gives us inclusive growth that can lift hundreds of million people out of poverty in our rural areas. Now, the inflationary bottlenecks are heightened, and we have about 17.8% inflation, which is the highest, I must say, in more than one decade. I'll leave the discussion of the fiscal deficits to Professor Orama, so I don't go over his own technical details. But I just want to focus on the fact that the issue of rising debt is of great concern. You got 21 countries that are actually at the risk of high debt distress or are already in debt distress. And so as you have rising interest rates, and you have weakening of local currencies, it means the cost of servicing debt continues to rise. And I'll come back to that in what I think are my own thoughts in terms of how we deal with that. But that continues to be a major challenge as sovereign spreads continue to rise. But then coming back to what I was saying in terms of the Africa's growth momentum, for us to have that projectile, not the leapfrog, this little frogs thing, require bold policies. Of course, we have to tackle inflation, but I want to say 5 things before I leave for you all to continue to discuss. Professor Rama will talk about digitalization, which is very, very important for us to have. Better tax administration, which of course you have to expand the domestic fiscal space. All of those things are fundamental things that we know, and we have to continue to do them. But I just want to close with 5 things that I think are very important for Africa to mobilize the pools of capital that it needs to be able to have faster growth. First is that a lot more effort needs to be put into domestic resource mobilization. The domestic resource mobilization is hinged on the development of the local capital markets. And so we have to do a lot in terms of that, raise financing local capital markets to meet the rising expenditure needs of our countries. That's the first point. The second point is the rising debt service costs of many countries, which has been worsened by the weakening of the domestic currencies, requires a reasonable balance to be achieved between the external and domestic borrowing. And I believe there ought to be a greater focus on lending local currencies to mitigate this rising foreign exchange risks that we have. And so I hope the panel discussion will go into some of these things, because when people talk about, Jeff talks about the issue of, infrastructure, that you need to borrow to do infrastructure. So if you're borrowing to do infrastructure, but if the revenue streams you're getting from infrastructure assets that you have are in local currency, and you're borrowing continuously in foreign currency, you're going to have a real problem. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have. So developing that local currency financing, it's very key for us to match the revenue streams to the cost of financing that we are having. Third, I believe countries need to do a better job of managing and deriving greater value from the enormous natural resources that they have through better governance, better transparency, avoiding transfer pricing, and of course making sure you have appropriate value and royalties and taxes to everything that you are generating. One of the things that I find very, very difficult to comprehend is that with all the minerals we have, oil, gas, metals, forest resources, carbon resources, and everything that we have, it's indefensible that Africa is poor. And I think that the wealth of Africa has been undervalued in many, many ways. And we need to do a better job of transparent governance over those natural capital assets, because that's what we have in trillions of dollars. But if we aren't using them well, we are not going to be able to have the domestic resources to grow our economy. So I would like to have a little bit more discussion and thought about how do we optimize, how do we use more efficiently the natural resource capital that we have. Unlocking that is going to be the key for us. So when you're talking energy, we've got everything. We've got solar, you've got forest stocks. We're going to be talking later today about the carbon sinks that we have sitting there in the Congo Basin and all of those things. So how do we properly value those things and make sure we can unlock more resources for ourselves is an issue for us to discuss. Fourth, the common framework, the G20 common framework. I think it needs to be accelerated big time. Yes, there are creditor committees that have been set up for coordinating the official and commercial creditors for Niger, for Mali, for Zambia, for Ethiopia, and for Ghana. But let's not kid ourselves. Progress is being made, but we are far from it. As I said in the beginning, we still have 21 countries that are right now at a high risk of their distress. So the common framework has to be faster. It has to move much faster for us to deal with this lingering debt issue. And finally, is the special drawing rights. And as you know, the African Development Bank has been working together with the Inter-American Development Bank to make sure that we can have access to these special drawing rights. The beauty about what we've been, in fact, when I sat there, Commissioner Muchanga was asking me, where are you guys with the SDRs? The SDR is a game changer for the continent. Because according to the model that we have, every single SDR that is used as hybrid capital within the capital stack of multilateral development banks, like ourselves, of course, we can leverage that 4 times. So you think $10 billion, that becomes $40 billion. So all the things that we are dealing with in terms of providing low-interest, long-term financing that Africa needs requires that we be smarter in how we use our current set of instruments, right? And so when people talk about the need to reform the global financial architecture, it's something to redesign a building. If your plumbing is still the same, and if your furniture is still the same, and everything is still the same, you haven't really done anything. And so we got to make sure that the limited resources we have, especially like the special drawing rights, we actually optimize that to be able to unlock huge value of financing for Africa. So we are delighted with where we are on this discussion together with the Inter-American Development Bank, and I'm hoping that according to the discussion we're having, that this will be discussed by the IMF board by the end of March. So that will be a big game changer for Africa for sure. And as you've heard me say, special drawing rights is called special drawing rights. That's what it is. Yeah. But we've got to tackle jobs, infrastructure, health, water, sanitation, education, skills development. All these things require huge amounts of money. So in my view, it's not that we just use SDR as something that's a reserve asset for central banks, but turn it away from being a static asset into a much more dynamic asset that you can use to unlock huge amount of resources that you need for the development stuff. And if we're able to do that, maybe you might consider even tweaking the name and instead of calling it special drawing rights, maybe we should call it supporting development revitalization, and that makes sure that you have the resources you need to do those things at scale. Once again, let me welcome you all to this session. I'm going to have Professor Rama come up and do that, but I want to say, let me first thank all the economists that are from the bank, all of the hard work that you all have put into this great report, and thank you very much, Honorable Commissioner Muchanga, for your hard work. Don't worry about me, I just have the flu, but it's not contagious, and so everything should be okay. Thank you.
Dr. Kinwumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank Group, His Excellency Commissioner Muchanga, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Excellencies, Ministers, and Executive Directors of the African Development Bank Group, Senior Management of the African Development Bank Group, fellow colleagues, staff of the African Development Bank Group, and all stakeholders joining us physically and those connected virtually. You are welcome to this year's presentation of the macroeconomic performance and outlook of the continent. In terms of the report, which the President has so clearly introduced to us, we have three sections when you get the report. The first section looks at the macroeconomic performance of the continent in 2023 and projections on how the continent would perform in 2024 and 2025 going forward. Then we provide a bird's eye view on the macroeconomic fundamentals of the continent that has underpinned what we have continued to see, which is going up and down, of GDP. The volatility we see in our GDP, we try to look into what is driving this volatility and how we can stabilize that. And that is where the issue of our structural transformation and massive financing, low-cost, long-term financing for infrastructure development on the continent that the President has highlighted became very clear to us, as well as investing in human capital development because of the impacts that has been seen to have on structural transformation in countries. We also looked at the major issues like debt and debt dynamics of the continent, but also the rising inflation and currency depreciations on the continent. And we then provided a bird's eye view on what the African Economic Outlook report will then be looking at, which is structural transformation in Africa and implications for the global financing architecture. That report will be launched in the at the annual meetings in May, which the President has already introduced. If I go into the presentation, the first slide you see there articulates what both the video we have watched and what the President has presented to us has shown us, which is a story of deepening resilience across African countries. Although the GDP of the continent slowed in 2023, we also see projections that is going to improve in 2024 and 2025, up to 4.1% in 2024, and we're expecting it to be much higher than the average GDP growth of countries around the world. So this slowdown has always been because of the multiple crises that the continent has been buffeted with in the past 4 or 5 years, which the President has so clearly articulated. But despite this, we see deepening resilience across African regions, African countries, and the different economic structures we have on the continent. And I'll go into details about those regional dimensions as I go forward in the presentation. And then Africa still remains the second fastest growing economy in the world. And not only that, over 11 countries on the continent will be among the 20 fastest growing economies in the world by 2025. I think that demands real appreciation of our leaders and the people of this continent because of the resilience we have been seeing. Because if you really looked at the prognosis, the COVID-19, the Russia-Ukraine war, the new war in the Middle East, you would expect that African economies will not perform as resilient as it has been. But because of fundamental fiscal consolidation and macroeconomic prudence we have seen across the continent is remaining solid. Then if you go to looking at the regional performance of different economies of the continent, we see again a consistent story that I have been trying to follow. East Africa. The Eastern Africa region continues to lead the continent not only in its diversification of its economies, but also structural consolidation and strengthening in several aspects of macroeconomic policy management. And the dividends are always seen in stable GDP growth, always going up remember, in 2020, we reported that this was the only region on the continent that did not see recession, even during COVID-19. So there is something to learn there. And we see projections now that the continent, the region, will grow by 5.1% in 2024, and even higher, up to 5.7% in 2025. And then in North Africa, we also see stable growth despite severe and adverse weather conditions that has always impacted on different macroeconomic fundamentals in that region. So that region is expected to grow at 3.9% in 2024 and even grow higher in 2025 at 4.1%. Central Africa has been doing very well as well, and the growth is forecast to continue to moderate this time at 3.5% in 2024, but again go higher to 4.1% in 2025. If you look at all these three regions, you can see clear blue markers on reform agendas that has been implemented in the macroeconomic policy management of many countries in these regions. And this is what is driving this resilience and positive growth trajectory we're seeing. In Southern Africa, the growth will improve this year from 1.6%, as we saw in the video, to 2.2% in 2024, but even higher to 2.6% in 2025. But that region remains the slowest growing region of the continent because of structural challenges that the largest economy in that region, i.e. South Africa, has been facing, especially in energy and other infrastructure challenges. West Africa also is expected to see higher growth in 2024, up to 4% and 4.4% in 2025. But even this higher growth is slowed by the largest economy in that region, Nigeria, but also the debt challenges that Ghana has been facing. Now we see a worry in that area as well with regard to the political issues that are emerging, which we are watching with regard to the impacts it might have on growth in that region. If you looked at the types of economy we have, we've always tried to look at resource-rich, non-resource intensive economies, resource-intensive economies, economies that are depending on tourism and so on. And we see broad-based growth, as you see on the right side of that slide, across all those types of economies. But one thing remains constant, since we have been presenting these post-COVID from 2020 to now, which is heightened consumer price inflation. This year, it grew even higher, as the president has already articulated for us, increasing by about 3.7 percentage points. It was 14.1% in 2022 on average, but now we're at over 17%. And this is driven by the lagged effects of high food and energy prices, inflation that we've seen, domestic factors like fiscal dominance, agricultural supply shocks, and imported inflation due to the weakening of local currencies in many of the large economies of the continent. But we still see that many countries in Africa escaped that inflationary impact because of some fundamentals in their economies. I will encourage you to read the report so that you can see the differences. But again, the inflationary impacts differed according to regions and also according to the types of economies. The highest inflationary rate we saw last year being in Eastern Africa at 30.6%. The clear data on the different inflationary rates in the different regions you can also find when you read the report. If I tell you everything, you will have no incentive to read the report. Now, when you go here, you find one major issue we're trying to track, being that monetary tightening in major economies in 2023 has pushed inflation down in the global economy. And we see that interest rate is now positive in the United States at over 2%, and then in the Eurozone at over 1.6%. And though these measures had austerity impacts it was necessary for those countries to go through that in order to come out the way they're now coming out. This is for us in Africa because when some of the policies that are being implemented, citizens might start feeling it, the impacts in the short term and lose sight of the medium to long term benefits of those policies. And here we try to look at the fiscal deficit on the continent, which has stabilized at 4.9% of GDP in 2023. And this stabilization mainly reflects fiscal consolidation measures undertaken across the continent, especially in countries with elevated risks of debt distress. Because of the engagements with the IMF and the G20 Common Framework and other issues, there was a lot more fiscal prudence in several countries of the continent last year, helping to improve their fiscal deficit position. Again, details on the directions of fiscal deficit by countries and regions you will find in the report, and reasons for this are also found in the report. On the other side, current account deficit is expected to widen from 2.0% in 2023 to 2.2% in 2024. Again, before stabilizing back to 2% in 2025. The reasons for this are also articulated in the report, and I'd encourage you to go to the report and see them there. Here, we talk about financial flows. The President has already clearly articulated for us the need for large, low-cost financing, long-term financing to finance infrastructure to drive structural transformation on the continent. But what we are seeing is that while FDI more than doubled in 2021 to about $80 billion US after the pandemic, it has fallen sharply in 2022 to just $45 billion. Now, the reliance on FDI is something then that countries need to look at, and that's why the recommendation on deepening domestic revenue mobilization that the President has already articulated for us. When you look at ODA, portfolio investments, remittances, and so on, you see very similar trends. Remittances is one we have watched since 2020 because it remains a stable source of financing for the continent. And I'm very happy to note that following the leadership of the President and the AU on the program we had on leveraging the diaspora, many countries are already having policies on diaspora bonds and securitizing remittances and so on. These are good directions to go. So if we go forward in the presentation, this is just looking at the debt, changes in debt to GDP ratio, which the President has talked about. While it's stabilizing in terms of the percentage to GDP, debt to GDP ratio on the continent, the debt repayment cost is still skyrocketing. Now above 10% of government revenue being used to service debt. That is an area that we need to continue to watch, and solving it are the recommendations that the President has already articulated for us, fast-tracking the common framework to help with the debt, addressing the debt issues in countries under distress, but also deepening domestic revenue mobilization and other policies you will find in the report that will help us to tighten the financial conditions and address the debt challenges that we are facing on the continent. Here, we then go into the bird's eye view on what the AEO 2024 is going to articulate, which is how to fast-track structural transformation on the continent in a long term. This is coming in parallel with another report that we are working with the African Union, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and many experts on key actions for driving inclusive growth in Africa. So we can identify several issues where the continent needs to focus if we want to address the volatility that we have seen, not tracking the growth performance of other countries and continents. So here we see that major issues we see, investment in infrastructure remains key for structural transformation, but also investment in human capital formation and human capital utilization can really rapidly increase the GDP growth rates to that double digits that the president was talking about. We've already established that if the continent continues to grow at this 3-point-something%, 4-point-something%, the incidence of poverty will continue to deepen. We need a growth rate of above 7% sustained over 4 decades before we can see the continent coming out of the pangs, the shackles of deep poverty that we have been seeing over the years. So the risks that we need to watch on the continent going forward are many, but we just identified just 4. Intensifying global and regional geopolitical tensions is a major risk that we need to watch. It doesn't need explanation too much. But also, the potential hikes in commodity prices might create some good wins for commodity exporters, but also deepen challenges in commodity importing countries on the continent. And our view, based on our analysis, even the commodity exporters on the continent has not always used the revenues that comes through that such booms in a very useful way. So we need clear policies on how to be able to leverage that potential boom we're seeing. But we're also seeing return of stress in the global financial system in several ways, which I'm not going to explain too much because I've taken already too much time. But increased regional conflicts and political instability is also something we need to watch strongly on the continent as we go forward. What are the key policy recommendations? Now, the president has already articulated the clear policy recommendations that came out of this report. And if you go into the report, you will see so many specific policies on how to address the issues of inflation and exchange rate volatility, specific policies on how to boost domestic revenue mobilization, and also build capacity of the continent on utilization of the revenue that is mobilized, i.e. addressing issues of public financial management. And that is why, under the leadership of President Adesina, we have been working on this Public Financial Management Academy. I'm so grateful and thank countries that have participated, and we had the first cohort of 26 countries, public officials from 26 countries graduate from the first cohort of that training program this year. I will encourage countries to participate more because that's the only way we can build our capacity to move this forward. But again, in addressing domestic revenue mobilization on the ground, bold actions needs to be taken by countries in terms of addressing the informal sector, fighting corruption, curbing wastages in public resources, and also promoting political certainty in the domestic markets so that we can build those, the domestic capital markets, as the president has talked about. But we also need to digitize our economies more to address the issues about transparency in tax collection and also in public financial management and use. The benefits of digitization has been well articulated in several reports. Addressing the debt distress, the president has talked about many of the things that we need to do, but beyond also rebalancing between external and domestic debt, what we see in many countries is also rebalancing between commercial and non-commercial debt, because we're seeing a tilting towards more commercial debts that are always short-term, high-cost, and sometimes opaque, and that is creating a lot of medium-term fiscal challenges for many countries on the continent. Managing and deriving greater revenue from our enormous natural capital, the president has already talked about it, and again, under his leadership, we are working on a program on valuing the green wealth of countries. And that will help us to rebase our GDP based on the natural assets that we have and the ecosystem services that is being delivered. And that will help in addressing several issues. The issues are around reforms in the global financial architecture, the special drawing rights that the president has talked about is already well articulated by the president, so I'm not going to go back to it. But we also need to adopt multi-pronged policies and approaches to stimulate structural transformation decisively on this continent so that we can strengthen our resilience. Investing in human capital is one of them. Resource-based industrialization and diversification of economies is another. We keep talking about this, but actions to make them happen is the only way that drives this industrialization and reforms that we're talking about. But addressing and engaging the global financial architecture to make that architecture fit for purpose for the continent is also something that is very central. And many colleagues like Professor Jeffrey Sachs and President Adesina have been championing all these quite across the globe. That, again, is advocacy that we need to continue to work on. Ladies and gentlemen, let me thank you at this stage and look forward to discussion of the findings of the report as we continue to engage with you in the production of the main report on addressing structural transformation on the continent. Thank you very much.
Professor Orama, I caution that you not go too far because I'm about to pull you back again. This stage could be a safety hazard potentially for females wearing heels. Fortunately, I'm the only one at risk, given that I'm the only female who'll be coming on stage, and I'll make sure that I tread carefully. But Prof, once again, thank you so much for sharing those insights. And I think they were quite salivating, and you have directed us to read the 78-page report in full, I think it is. And I certainly look forward to doing so, to gain a thorough, deeper understanding. But I have asked Professor Orama to stay on stage because, of course, this is the point where we are moving into the formal unveiling of the report. And I would just like to welcome Dr. Adesina back to join Professor Orama, as well as His Excellency Ambassador Albert Muchanga, who, of course, many of you know, is the Commissioner for Trade and Industry at the African Union Commission.
Okay.
All right, so this is the formal unveiling. I am told, and perhaps maybe one of the assistants can help with the unveiling. All right.
Thank you. Can we get copies of the report? Copies of the report? They're there. Marilaw, please can you join us? Professor Sachs, please can you join us? Yasin? Let them come. Yes. Yes, let them bring all they're bringing copies for us. Just come right up, please. Okay. Okay. Okay, please come over here. Please, side. Okay.
Yes. Yasin, please.
Yasin, go ahead.
Thank you.
Okay.
Let's see. Yes, thank you.
All right. We're smiling. Yeah. Africa is doing well.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jump now. Thank you, thank you.
Professor Orama. So once again, I'd caution you not to go too far. because I'm about to call you back again. Of course, we're going into the section where we're going to have a discussion about the key findings of the reports. A lot of smart individuals are in this room, and we've got the pleasure of engaging many of them on the findings, as well as yourselves as audience members. I did allude to the fact that there is an opportunity to ask questions. And so could I please ask to welcome Professor Orama on stage at this present moment in time, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who is the Director for Sustainable Development over at Columbia University in the USA. Can we kindly welcome him with an applause? Also, His Excellency Ambassador Albert Muchanga, the Commissioner for Trade and Industry at the AU. Sir, can you kindly join us on stage? Another warm welcome for him with an applause, please. And we also have Professor Abebe Shimeles, the Honorary Professor for the University of Cape Town, and Advisory Ministry of Finance. And last but not least, I believe we do have Professor, or rather His Excellency Professor Mthuli Ncube, who the Minister of Finance and Economic Development over at Zimbabwe, who may be joining us virtually. If that happens, we'll certainly let you know. So I'm also going to take my seat at this present moment in time. Okay. So Professor, you and I can share a mic, and then afterwards the middle mic will be for the other speakers. And I think that it is important just to reflect on the message that was shared during the opening remarks, particularly referencing the percentage growth that we are proud of as a continent, in terms of the fact that quite a number of the top growing economies in the world come from here, but also the realism that was put on that percentage growth, just given the fact that people don't eat percentages. Percentages don't fund their living, and percentages certainly don't shield them from some of the adverse effects of climate change, for instance. So the message and the question that I hope that we'll be able to better address right now is how to translate the percentage growth of Africa. And Professor Orama, you mentioned the need for the continent to grow by 7% consistently for 4 decades to achieve some of its goals. Even with that, how to ensure that when we do get there, it is done in such a way that is sustainable, such that a lot more people do have food on their plates, a lot more people have got more money in their pockets. And as I said, a lot more of us are insulated from some of the risks, the broader risks that are keeping a lot of people down in terms of poverty and inequality. So first of all, I'd just like the speakers, other than Professor Orama, just to reflect on some of the key findings of the report as they do pertain to the state of the African economy right now. And Professor Sachs, perhaps just to kick it off with you, sir.
Thank you very much. First, excuse me, this is an excellent report. So I'm extremely happy to read it and to learn from it. Sorry.
Take some water.
Yeah, thank you. It shows a mixed picture. Africa is achieving moderate economic growth, but there is a considerable amount of financial fragility. This is the main picture. And we want to move from this situation to a situation of much higher growth, which is absolutely feasible, and lower financial fragility. Those go together because, in fact, to get to 7% or even higher growth per year will require long-term, low-cost finance at the center of the strategy. And what one of the very telltale graphs shows is Africa is paying a punishing risk premium on its finance, and it cannot achieve rapid growth if it is paying a risk premium of 750 or 1,000 or even higher basis points on its debt. So, to my mind, the core messages are that Africa is in a circumstance in which it can achieve this goal of sustained, very rapid growth, but it requires a financial, fiscal, and transformation strategy to do so. And many of the elements of that have been laid out. I want to underscore a few points quickly. First, long-term development cannot be based on short-term loans. This is the most important point. Loans for Africa should be at least 25 years or longer. This is a central role for the African Development Bank, but it also means that the Eurobond market is a trap, because if it's 7-year bonds, there will be liquidity crises inevitable when rollovers are needed. We need a financing strategy based on long-term development and long-term borrowing. The maturity structure is fundamental because African countries, sovereigns, borrow in foreign currencies to a significant extent. That will remain true for years to come. That means that there's always liquidity risk, and that means that short-term borrowing is dangerous for long-term development. Just to say, I won't go on too long, I know we have such a wise panel, but to say 7% per year growth means a doubling every 10 years. If you do that 4 times, Africa's economy will be 16 times larger than it is today. What looks like a lot of debt today won't be very large in the future. Africa can bear a lot more debt, in fact, because of rapid growth prospects. But if the debt is 7 years or 10 years and the growth requires 30 to 40 years, there will inevitably be the kinds of fragility that we have right now. This comes to the question of strategy and global financial architecture. We need a much larger African Development Bank. We need much larger long-term funding. When there are partners like the Belt and Road Initiative in China, which I'm a great fan of, the lending should be at least a quarter century, and this is a point that the AU can make in the G20 context to the partners, which is we have the highest growth prospects in the world. This is no doubt true. Africa can grow faster than any other part of the world. It has more headroom, more catching up space. It can achieve absolutely 7 to 10% per year growth, sustained for 4 decades. But it requires the financing and the partnership to do it. What else does it require? It requires the following: a very strong integration at the AU scale. Africa is the same size population as China and as India. Those are each one country. Africa's 55 countries. Africa has to act, though, like one economy. This is extremely important because that scale will be the breakthrough. That's to the advantage of every single one of the 55 countries joined together. Second, that means cross-border infrastructure for power, for fiber, for transport is absolutely essential. This is a great continent, and it needs a great continental infrastructure. This is absolutely key. And the third point that I would emphasize, because I would love to have the chance with these esteemed colleagues to discuss for hours, but the third point that I would emphasize is get every African child in school for a good education at least through upper secondary. Right now, the completion rate of upper secondary is only around 30%. It needs to be 100%. That's basically a financial barrier, by the way. I think every leader here wants universal education but can't afford it. And this is why finance is so essential. But don't finance education with a 10-year loan. The kids will still be in 10th grade. Finance education with a 40-year loan to give them the chance to graduate, join the workforce, be the skilled workers of the future, and 40 years from now, it will be easy to repay. Education has an internal rate of return of at least 20% per annum. But it takes a long time. You can't hurry it. It's one grade at a time. So long-term finance, get every child in school, give them the fiber, give them the digital, give them the basic infrastructure. Africa will be the world's booming, fast-growing region of the world for decades. So this is to move from where we are today, some reasonable performance, but fragility, to the best performance with financial robustness. I think that's the objective. Thank you.
And Prof, a really interesting comment that you do make in reference to the Euro bond market being a trap. Just given the, I think the resumption of players entering that bond market that we have seen in the recent while, particularly since the advent of the pandemic. But I want to pick up on a point that you made around scale and Africa acting more as one. And Ambassador Muchanga, I want to pick it up with you. Just as you obviously reflect on the macroeconomic performance outlook, but we do know that one of the ways that the continent is trying to scale up and act more as one is through the Africa Continental Free Trade Area deal. Much has been said about what has been done on the ground so far, what hasn't been done on the ground so far. Perhaps your reflections then on the state of trade dynamics and the potential that, of course, it does have in helping us realize the better growth that we all want to see.
Thank you very much.
I think you might want to switch it on, just make sure that the green light is on.
Okay. So no.
Now.
Thank you very much. So there's no gender balance, eh? But we're not intimidating you. I think before I go to the issue of continental economic integration, actually it was my #1 point in my notes. Let me congratulate the African Development Bank Group for this publication. It's the second one. Very, very, very well researched, very informative, and it's going to be very useful to the policymakers, and like we indicated, the researchers. And certainly, I would encourage you to ensure that when the heads of state and government are meeting tomorrow, if there can be a way of putting the document on their tables. I know there's going to be complaint about language, but at least if they can get the information, that would be very, very, very useful. Professor Sachs raised a fundamental issue, and that's the continental integration. I always say that the long-term future of Africa lies in the accelerated and deeper economic integration. Because the small economies that we have really do not make us very, very competitive in the global markets. And the situation is getting worse now. Because if any one of us wants to export, for example, if you want to export to Europe, you are going to face the cross-border adjustment mechanism. That's another barrier to you really exporting. So if you have an internal market, it's much, much, much easier. And when that market is also functioning very, very well, it can promote productive transformation, by ensuring that there is value addition and there's intra-African trade in manufactured goods, and key also intra-African trade in intermediate goods. Because when you look at the structure of manufacturing in Africa, the highest cost element is on the importation of inputs going into manufacturing. We really do not come up with intermediate goods which you can use to add value within the domestic market and trade across the border. So that's one issue where every year we should be emphasizing that we need to deepen the process of economic integration. Now, the other number that I'm very much interested in, the growth rate is very, very important. But the GNI per capita of Africa, I think we need to be looking at that number. Where are we right now? I'm raising this issue because a few days ago, I was reading one report, and it indicated that since 2014, GNI per capita in Africa has been declining by about 10%. I don't know how far true that is. So I think in future editions, let's try to capture that number. It's quite useful. When we go to the G20, a number of issues are going to be high on our agenda. And one of the issues is very sensitive, but we would like to collaborate with the African Development Bank Group and other knowledge partners. And this is the issue of international taxation. The African group, led by Nigeria, were able to win a decision that we should start discussing the question of a framework convention on international tax cooperation, which is inclusive. When the vote came out, virtually all the OECD countries voted against us, except Norway. And their position is that they already have the G20 OECD inclusive framework on base erosion and profit shifting. So in their view, that is enough. So what we need is really to see if we can establish dialogue between ourselves as Africa or the Global South and the OECD to see if there can be a meeting of minds on the efforts that we are making in that area. The issue of debt restructuring is very, very, very important. A few days ago, I was in discussion with one of at the State Department at the US, used to be Assistant Secretary at the Treasury, indicated that we welcome the Commonwealth framework on debt restructuring, but it's very, very slow. And I think there's a misunderstanding within the official creditors and between the official creditors and the private creditors. Each one of them think they are giving more than the other. So they cannot really compare how they are making, they are contributing to the debt restructuring effort. So it's one of the urgent issues that we need to bring to the G20 to say, how can we facilitate faster debt restructuring? And I think, as emphasized in your report, a lot of our countries are facing debt distress situations. The president of the African Development Group raised an important issue of natural resource governance. As we are going to the COP28, I think there are a number of stories about African countries having carbon trading deals with the other countries around the world. And the numbers that were coming out were very disheartening. It's really, we're underpricing our assets. So again, the African Development Bank, I think we need to work with the countries to ensure that we have common guidelines so that when our countries go, our governments go to really engage in carbon trading, I think we do not undersell our assets. And other than the guidelines, also I think that the issue of accounting for the forestry that we have, we indicated that we are working on that one, which is very, very good. and also training the negotiators on how to come up with very good deals. But right now, I think we are underselling ourselves. So on the whole, it's a very, very good report, and we encourage you to continue publishing it and distribute it as much as you can. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I am now told that we are being joined on the line by Professor Mthuli Ncube, His Excellency. Thank you. His Excellency Professor Mthuli Ncube, of course, the Minister of Finance of Zimbabwe. Sir, oh, we see you. You're looking well. Compliments for the new year, sir. Prof, we are just look at him from the front. We are looking at the state of the African economy. We have been told that we continue to house some of the world's largest growing economies. Of course, this is not entirely new, just given that before we even went into the pandemic, a lot of the top growing economies came from the African continent. But so we're also being told of the importance of certain dynamics in making sure that Africa gets to the next step around restructuring some of the financial construct or architecture, that of course being one in part the responsibility of the traditional architects. But also I would say it is the responsibility of African governments, as it were, to ensure that that restructuring is done well, but also to ensure that they keep their part of the bargain in upholding the highest standards of governance when it does come to how money in the country essentially is being used. So I know that Zimbabwe is trying to do quite a number of things right now in terms of its debt restructuring, also in terms of restoring credibility in its financial markets, particularly its currency. Perhaps we can start off there, so, and just talk about what the state of play is right now, but also more broadly speaking, how you are thinking of the path forward for the African continent, sir. Prof, are you on mute? Not clearly. Perhaps we can see if there's something that can be done technically to raise his sound. Not entirely. If the sound or the technical team perhaps at the back can see what they can do. Okay, so we'll come back to you, Minister, in just a short while, once the sound has been adequately tested, if that's all right. Okay, I'll wait for guidance from the floor in that regard. Suffice to say that if I come to you, Prof. Shimilis, for your reflections. We've heard quite a lot that has been said so far about the number of countries on the continent that are in debt distress. Okay, perfect. That are in debt distress at this present moment in time. We know that the risks of defaults are high, and there has been a few casualties in the recent past. Your reflections, sir, on the topic of hand today, and maybe even interventions on the issue around debt distress right now and defaults on the continent.
Thank you very much. Let me also express my appreciation to the African Development Bank for inviting me to this wonderful event. And good to be in the company of friends. I have been in this business also with them for a long time. So the African Economic Outlook, as most of you know, has brought out the African voice in a very, very telling way. So I would like to thank Professor Kevin Urama, who is the chief economist, leading this pack. And the preparation that it takes to come to this point is extremely, extremely laborious and requires a lot of expertise, care, particularly to inform, influence, and inspire African decision makers and tell their story as it is. Now that's what we heard today, the resilience of African economies. We don't talk much about it. But most importantly, in the light of this major, unprecedented, and rapidly evolving global shocks, Africa is still there, maintaining a steady economic growth. Even macroeconomic stability is not as bad as it would have been, given the kind of economic management we used to have a few decades back. So we are holding very well. Actually, the 18% inflation rate, if you take out a few extremely in high inflation situation, countries like Ethiopia, for instance, and others, the average inflation rate in Africa is low. Now, when it comes to the debt issue which you mentioned, I think already it has been mentioned in the report, but also distinguished panelists and the president of the African Development Bank said that Africa is not a bankrupt economy. It's not a continent that should have been suffering from liquidity challenges that we see today. But also some of the challenges I would like to apportionate to two causes. One is, of course, our own economic management. The other is the global financial system itself. The way it's built and the way it functions doesn't serve the interests of Africa. This is well noted. I think, as the commissioner indicated, there are a lot of gaps and holes in how to deal with the debt situation we are in today. So let me just mention first, what does it mean even a country is in debt distress? You know, there are different ways of looking at it. If you look at Ethiopia, for instance, the debt to GDP ratio is much lower than anywhere else. But the cost of borrowing, and of course, the returns to the debt investments that we have made, has not been aligned, unfortunately. So it has put us in a liquidity crunch. However, the country can revive and even be able to carry a large amount of debt to finance its investment needs. Ethiopia has been growing, for instance, over 10% for over a decade with an investment to GDP ratio of 40%, unseen in many African countries, a saving rate that shoot up from merely 5% to 22% in 2019. So you know, the country could transform itself within a short space of time. For instance, as the president of the bank mentioned, had the global financing mechanisms been favorable, like the interest rate 9% charging poor countries, what is the point? By credit agencies. The ratings are based on, not on needs, on vulnerabilities, but rather more ability to pay, which is defined from their prism. So I think African voice have reached to a point where global financial architecture has to be significantly overhauled. It has to be inclusive, it has to be just, and it has to be also gives room for what we call global safety nets during liquidity challenges. So I think what we are seeing debt distress today is artificially created by a system where the African potentials are not captured well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. A system. A system that has been historically unfair in a sense, but I like what you did mention, so about the fact that some of the challenges that we are experiencing as a continent is as a result of some of our own mismanagement. I mean, I just reflect on the country that I come from, South Africa, and we're talking about domestic resource mobilization and the liquidity of capital markets. We've got the largest on the continent, and we've got an active participation of investors in it, but we also pay a very high price for that debt, just as a result of unfairness in ratings, of course, but a lot of it being as a result of mismanagement when we do look at how economic affairs have been managed, when you also look at what is happening regarding the infrastructure around our electricity and our ports. With that said, I'd like to see if we can get Professor Minister of Finance, of course, Mthuli Ncube back with us. The system, so the system. Yes, there you go. Wonderful, wonderful. So I'll hand the virtual floor to you. Okay, Minister. We heard him just a moment ago. Minister Ncube, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
And we can hear you clearly too, so you can continue.
Thanks very much. Just to congratulate the African Development Bank for the report, it is really on point, and I think they raise very pertinent issues about Africa's growth prospects for 2024, and also appreciate the contributions from Professor Sachs and Commissioner and Professor Babebe Shmeles, very important points that they raise indeed. Just looking at the growth pattern, I really agree that my region, which is Southern Africa, is really projected to grow the slowest. I want to highlight a factor here, which is that of climate change. That, for example, in Zimbabwe, we expect growth to slow down. Last year, we had a growth rate of 5.3%. In 2024, we expect a growth rate of 3.5%, likely due to climate shocks. So really, we expect a lower rainfall pattern is already showing. And, as they say that in our part of the world, a Minister of Finance is also a Minister of Agriculture. So I worry whether the rains are good or not. And it means I have to start worrying about, grain imports, and that's real. So really, it means we have to invest more in climate-proofing our agriculture if we want to, I think, achieve sustainable economic growth. So climate-proofing agriculture is a very critical issue in ensuring sustained economic growth going forward. Let me raise another issue regarding debt. Again, the debt situation is rather elevated. We're aware a few countries trying to restructure their debts, including ourselves. For example, we've got the G20 Common Framework, and I believe that was Zambia, Ghana, Ethiopia, Chad are on that program, and Zimbabwe has got a different program. We've started our own engagement with creditors to try to restructure our debt and get some debt relief. It's really holding back economic growth if we don't deal with it, and we're determined that this be sorted out. So that process is continuing. It means that we would have to then focus on specific reforms, economic reforms, governance reforms, and also reforms around property rights for the agricultural sector. So we're working very well with all our creditors, and we hope that over the next year or two, the issue of debt in Zimbabwe will be resolved. But let me highlight something else. If you look at global interest rates, this has been mentioned in the report and by other panelists, interest rates have really shot up, and this is an issue, including SDRs. I don't know if the colleagues are aware that when we received the SDRs from the IMF, the interest rates were like 0.2% or something. And now the interest rate of SDRs is more like 4.5%. So even resources that we thought were concessionary are no longer concessionary. And this really speaks to the changing credit situation globally. where interest rates have gone up, and we're feeling the pain of the debt service costs. An issue was raised by President Adesina on this natural resource governance issues. I must say Zimbabwe takes this very, very seriously. And in the case of the lithium sector, we've actually passed a law that really no exporter should export raw lithium, for example. Everything should be beneficiated up to the level of lithium sulfate, because that way you can increase the price easily 10 times by just insisting on beneficiation. This will improve our export sales. So really, as part of that natural governance is insisting on beneficiation, and I think that's the right thing to do. The other issue that we're really insisting on is that is really the removal of all tax, incentives for the mining sector, in the sense that why give these tax incentives? The mining sector, they know how to give themselves tax incentives through all manner of structures that they can put in place with the help of the accountants. So why should governments do that? But really, we should be insisting on beneficiation. If they beneficiate, that's why we should be giving tax incentives at the beneficiation stage in terms of the value chain for these minerals. I thought those are the things really that we should be highlighting. Now, coming to the we are grappling with inflation here on the domestic front. I think we'll deal with it successfully. We have tight monetary policy, and so it is partly the reason why growth will be slightly slower, because of the tightness of liquidity. But it's necessary for us to deal with inflation and for us to be able to live within our means. I must say that on the fiscal front in Zimbabwe, we've really done well over the last 5 years. I've run deficits that are no more than 1.5% of GDP. They've all averaged 1.5% of GDP. We've done very well, but it's because I really have made by running a quasi-cash budgeting system and making sure that we don't live above our means. Then on the current account, I noticed that the report does say that will come under some squeeze. That is true even for us. We have had a current account surplus for the last 5 years, but this year, 2024, will be the smallest surplus. We're now down about $80 million from as high as $400 million 5 years ago. So really the what's in the report and what we're experiencing in Zimbabwe is very consistent, and I congratulate the ADB for this report. Let me stop here for now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And of course, thanks also to Prof. Sachs, who has to step out at this present moment in time. Professor Ram, I'm going to come to you in just a short while, but I just would also like the audience to know that we will be opening up for questions in a moment or two. So if there's any contribution that any of you will make, just indicate with the show of your hand. And what I wanted to ask you is the situation around the hard landing, and how much of a viability it is for certain parts of the continent. You have made mention of the fact that inflation continues to shoot in the wrong direction in many parts of Africa. And what we have seen is a continued aggressive intervention from central bankers. Let me not call it aggressive, because really they're trying to do all that they can do to bring this inflation down. But the question is at what cost, and whether this inflation is what actually takes a few economies into real recession or into a real hard landing on the African continent. Your interventions on that, sir, and how much of a viability a hard landing is for Africa, and which parts of Africa right now?
Thank you very much for that question. Before going into that, let me really appreciate the inputs and comments that's been made by the panelists, some of them traveling far and beyond to be here. Professor Jeffrey Sachs and his beautiful wife, Sonia Sachs, traveled all the way from the US to be here. We really appreciate that. And Commissioner Muchanga, my brother, Abebe Shimeles, and President Adesina, yourself, really appreciate you. And all those who are connected online, I know we have hundreds of you if not thousands, connected, and those who are really here. The point you raise is one that is really sometimes touchy to discuss. Managing inflationary pressures often comes with, you call it hard landing, but maybe austerity measures also for countries. Because that's why I hinted that in my presentation, we've seen the fiscal consolidation that happened in the United States, in the Eurozone in the past 2 years. It was tough for citizens. Energy prices went up, food prices went up. Many things really had significant issues there. But the difference is that then there is also fiscal policy measures that are put in place to cushion that impact on the most vulnerable, ensuring that while interest rates are going up, it doesn't crowd out small and medium scale enterprises, and it doesn't also impact on the vulnerable households significantly. And many African countries are doing that in terms of providing measures to cushion those impacts on countries. But the only thing I would say is that it's like pulling teeth. When you have a bad tooth, going to the dentist is often scary because it's painful. But when the tooth is pulled out, you feel better later. So that short-term hard or impacts of monetary and fiscal policies to address these challenges that we're having should not be a disincentive for not pulling out that tooth. Because if you leave the tooth, maybe it will affect more and more tooth, and then you have more problems going forward. So what I have seen in many African countries is actually a stellar job being done by central banks to try and manage inflation, actually using tools that in the continent is not as effective as it should be because of several structural factors in the economy that we have discussed in the report. But then we're seeing a lot of dividends in terms of, like in the Western Africa region, the Nigerian government has been implementing a lot of policies, tough for citizens, but we're seeing projections of growth rebounding in 2024, 2025 because of those policies. So my encouragement to citizens and policymakers is to ensure that we have a measured approach and a balanced approach between monetary and fiscal policy to ensure that it doesn't create hard landing too much for citizens.
Okay. I think they refer to it as the Goldilocks scenario, that balance of those two measures. Any questions from the floor before we close? Or comments that you'd like to make? Okay, I think that everything that has been, or that was required to be said, has been said. But any parting shots from the panel before I hand over to you, Professor Orama, for the official close?
Let me share a secret with you.
It's on, sir.
Which one of you slept 8 hours last night? Any hands? I slept 1 hour, 40 minutes. Wow. But because of my commitment to this meeting, I said I'm going to be strong. So I went to bed about 20 to 6, and about 7:10 I was up to be here. Yeah. Having said that, I think my parting shot is that we've got very good partnership with the African Development Bank, and certainly when we move together, we are stronger. So as African Union Commission, we'll always be on hand whenever we have to move together to say, let's move together. And as we go into the G20, the African Development Bank is going to be one of our knowledge partners. So the information that is coming out is going to be translated into policy proposals when we are making proposals at the level of the G20. So the work you are doing is very, very useful. And once again, congratulations.
No, I think it's been a wonderful discussion. Just to follow up on the inflation hard landing you mentioned. I was in Nairobi last year, living there throughout the COVID time, and nothing of the sort happened until the war in Ukraine triggered a significant hike in the prices. Even, when the government was pouring money during the COVID time, increased subsidies, reduced taxes, and spent a lot on social protection, things were okay. And then the war in Ukraine, for various reasons, we don't need to go into it, prices, inflation started to rise, not only in Kenya, but in many, many African countries. So this is beyond their control. One is that fact. The other is the shock therapy that Prof mentioned may not have to be painful as well. So there are, I think the AU Commissioner mentioned, and which I indicated earlier again, the international financial architecture need to respond to this narrowing physical space in African countries at the time where they were doing excellent job managing the economy from collapsing. So that is my parting point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And thank you, not to keep anyone in this room here any further. Ambassador, I get your point. But many people are tired and do need to rejuvenate. But just perhaps if we can just get a closing remark from Professor Tuli Ncube, the Minister of Finance over at Zimbabwe. So I'm not too sure how many hours of sleep that you had, and at the risk of being unpopular to you also, just to spare a minute or two more of your time. So just to let us know what you'd like us to take away.
Thank you very much. I was only awake for, rather sleep for 3 hours, so much shorter than the commissioner. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes, we can hear you.
We can hear you, sir.
Oh, fabulous. I think really the AFDB should continue with the thought leadership drive to assist us who are policymakers on the ground, assist us in making sure that we can support those critical growth drivers that will continue to build resilience, that will enable us to build the national shock absorbers, to be able to absorb all these shocks, whether it's price shocks or interest rate shocks, HDFDB to continue doing this steady work. For us here, the issue really is climate change. That is a shock that is we need to respond to, and we have to invest in climate proofing our agriculture, and I suspect other countries in Southern Africa will be doing the same. Here I can think of a country like Mozambique, which will be affected by similar issues, Mozambique, but also Malawi, which will be affected by similar climate conditions. So this is a real. The other issue that's urgent for us is one of debt restructuring. So really any continental driven ideas about dealing with this issue rather than on a one-on-one basis would be helpful, so that we have a comprehensive, holistic approach on how Africa could be assisted in this debt restructuring drive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And just on my parting shot, big congratulations, obviously, for yourselves, but Professor Rama, the entire team that contributed to these insights. I think that now the work does stand with those who are at the close proximity of policymakers who can ensure that a lot of the change and the recommendations that this report advocates for can be done and should be implemented. And what I can say is that us as members of the media, we also look forward to understanding further the insights of this report so we can continue to hold to account those of you who you know should be doing more. But with that said, thank you to everyone also for your participation. It's a close. Thank you, thank you. Just And also just one last message from me, the panelists. Before you leave, can you please just kindly go outside for a photo opportunity as well? Thank you.